Hi, I'd like to take a couple minutes to talk a little bit about outlining and what I expect in the outlines we do for this class. So, many people have been taught to outline in different ways, using phrases or keywords or things like that. For an outline in this class, what I'm looking for is really just the argument structure. And in that sense, what we're dealing with is not so much just an outline as a conceptual skeleton. And especially when we think of it in relationship to a speech, this is really not the speech itself, but the kind of skeleton of the speech, the underlying structure and logic that you will use in your speech. So, a couple of key things to consider and understand as we're going through. First is to making sure that you have a thesis. A thesis is not numbered and is therefore not kind of technically part of the outlined format. It is the main point. Everything in the outline is subordinate to. It's everything that is supported by the outline. Then each main point in the outline is a single claim. So because everything in the outline is a claim to build an argument structure, need to be in single complete sentences. Now, the labeling of the different parts is more or less arbitrary. I call the top points main points, subpoints, support, then details, subpoints, and so on and so forth. Most of the outlining structures I've seen identify those as subpoints, 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 and so on and so forth. It doesn't really matter as long as you follow kind of a consistent numbering scheme, indenting scheme to show the relationship between the points. Because the relationship between the points is what matters. And I want to take a minute to talk a little bit about that to make sure we're using the same terms and concepts when we're talking about points. So when we're talking about points that are on the same level, whether they're these kind of ones and twos, or you're talking about the relationship between A and B, or if you're talking about the relationship between point Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2. Whichever that is, when you're talking about points at the same level, you're talking about points that are coordinate. Coordinate points work together in the same way to answer a question at that same level. So, in this sense, each Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 both are independent answers for why we should believe the thesis. In the same way, subpoint 1 and subpoint A and subpoint B are both independent reasons for why we should believe the main point 1. Right? And in that sense, they're all coordinate. Let me clean that up a little bit now. So those are coordinate pieces, but when we're talking about the relationship of supporting something, what we're talking about is subordination, or we're talking about subordinate pieces. So that's the relationship between a point at a superior level and a lower level. So the relationship of point 1 to B is subordinate. Point 1 answers a question of why should I believe, or how should I understand, or what's the reason for accepting subpoint 1? What's my evidence for that? If I ask that of one point, then the answer should be a point that is subordinate. This should be all of it. Everything in 1 should support that, and everything in 2 should be a separate and independent reason for supporting it. One of the problems a lot of people have is that they tend to write outlines sequentially. So, like, you're just kind of going through a whole story, a series of arguments, and you're just putting each next step at that lower level down. And that doesn't make sense for an argument structure. In an argument structure, each lower level is subordinate to the higher level. Now, that higher level is often called the superordinate point. And all that means is that we're looking at the sort of the same relationship, but from the other direction. So B here is superordinate to 1. 1 is subordinate to B. Now let's look at the example outline and see how some of that works out. Now, this is an example outline for an argumentation or a forensic thesis that has to do with the trial in the book To Kill a Mockingbird. Tom Robinson was convicted for rape of a woman named Mayella Ewell, and this is the defense argument against his conviction. So I have a series of 4 main points that I use to put together for undermining that argument, all of which are subordinate to that thesis. Now, as we go through, I want you to notice a couple of things. First really should be that this outline is very short. It does not detail everything in the argument, and it would take 5 to 7 minutes probably to be able to explain all the things that are in this outline. But I don't want to write an outline that is my whole speech. My goal here is just to make sure I have an underlying argumentative structure for that speech. The other thing to look at is the way I'm using citations here. So I've got citations at each point where I'm using evidence. And that's going to be in either those subpoints or especially in those pieces of support. Those should be almost exclusively evidence. And I don't need to go into much more detail than that. They just need to be the main idea from those pieces of evidence that I'm using. And then I've cited here in MLA format, and then I have citations below in a works cited. Then I've just identified each of those key points. Now, as you're going through and developing your outlines, the key things that I'm going to be looking for are making sure that these kind of key points in the outline, that you have that thesis, that you have clear points that each are independent reasons to accept or believe that thesis, and that each of those main points have some support in there to give them what we might call a prima facie reason for believing them, that they are justified by the research and reasoning that you're providing there. So if I look through your argument structure, I should be able to see that as a reasonable argument, where if I believed everything you put down, then I would have to accept your claim. That's what I'm looking for in terms of developing your outline, and if you have a clear argumentative structure, you're going to have a more solid and more well-developed speech. That's all for now. Let me know if you have